Okay, so we are a couple of minutes past the hour here, so I will go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Robin Nicholson, and I am an intern with Research Data Canada, and I will be co-presenting with RDC Executive Director Mark Leggett today on the topic of National Data Services Framework Summit 2020 Summary and Outputs. Please note that the session, both audio and video, is being recorded and will also be made available on RDC's website along with the slides. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from my home base in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. My co-presenter, Mark Leggett, is based on Prince Edward Island, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Abigwit Mi'kmaq First Nation. So as mentioned, today's webinar will focus on the summary and outcomes of the NDSF Summit 2020. We will begin with a background of the National Data Service Framework and Summit event. This will be followed by a discussion of this year's summit, which took place back in February of this year. Participant feedback from that event informed two key documents, a summary and recommendations document and an updated version of the Canada Declaration, which was initially produced after the 2019 summit. After discussing both of these key outputs, we will round out today's session by looking forward to next year's NDSF Summit 2021 and take some time to answer any questions. Here are the links and the DOIs to the two main NDSF Summit 2020 outputs we will be covering today, both in English and French. All of these documents are published in the RDC Zenodo repository. And here are links to the slide deck we will be using today, both in English and French, if you'd like to follow along. These will also be made available after today's session. Today's session features both English and French audio channels via Zoom's simultaneous interpretation feature. To access this feature, simply select the interpretation option from the right-hand side of your Zoom menu to select your preferred language. The recording of this session, along with the slides, will be made available in both English and French. I will mention that this is actually only our second time offering simultaneous interpretation for a webinar, so we would deeply appreciate any feedback on the experience from any of our French listeners today. After closing the window for today's webinar, you will be prompted to complete a short survey inquiring whether you used the French channel today and whether you were satisfied with the service. Please feel free to reach out to Mark or myself as well with any additional feedback. Our contact information is on a slide at the end of the session. We would also ask that if you have any questions of Mark or I today, please enter them in the Q&A box to allow us to keep better track. The Q&A option can be found at the bottom of your Zoom screen in your menu. We will be monitoring questions as they come in, and time will be allotted at the end of the session to answer them in the order in which they were entered. I will now pass it over to my co-presenter, Mark Leggett, Executive Director of Research Data Canada, who is going to begin today's session with the background of the National Data Services Framework and past summit events and outcomes. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Robin. And I should take this opportunity to thank Robin. She's been a really important part of RDC's webinar series in the last number of months, and our third intern. So it's been great. And like all good interns, Robin is going on to another opportunity soon. So she'll be with us for a little while longer, but not too long. So I did want to give a public acknowledgement and thank you to Robin for all her help in the last number of months. Might as well go to the next slide, Robin. So there probably, I can see from the participant list that a number of the folks who've joined the webinar today were at the summit. So my apologies for duplicating something that you've heard before, but just to kind of give a little bit of context and background. RDC has been using the phrase National Data Service and National Data Services Framework for ever since I've been involved. So coming on to 5 years. So a national data service is quite simply a service, whether it's machine service or human or appropriate service that provides one or more data-related functions to stakeholders, whether they be researchers or funders or someone else in that national context. We started using the term National Data Services Framework because we thought it was a good way to highlight that the conversations that we have are a very important part, but they're not the only part of Canada's efforts and RDC's contributions to those efforts to build national data services. So I always use this three-part definition of the NDS framework. It is a conversation like the one we're having today, and RDC has a very broad stakeholder community who function at a range of levels in a lot of the institutions or all the types of institutions involved in research in Canada. It's also an agreement on best practices, standards, and protocols. So RDC does spend a substantial amount of time interfacing with international colleagues and those in Canada as well on what would be considered best practices in the delivery of national data services and data management. And then especially as our new national DRI organization, or NDRIO, comes into being, it will be a suite of interoperable services and resources, both through that national NDRIO organization as well as the institutions and regional organizations that have been doing it for some time now. Next slide. So that's an important definition for us. We also take a fairly high level view of what it means in those latter two definitions in that three-part definition. This is the high level diagram that we use when we talk about National Data Services Framework, either in the Research Data Canada context or with my colleagues at Canary, who fund Research Data Canada and who have been have delivered 2 calls of research data management funding to the broader community. So this is a definition that essentially says that starting with the network and the compute that takes advantage of that network, you have all kinds of data repositories and other types of services that ultimately service researchers across the country and ideally follow best practices and the FAIR principles as in findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So this is our, again, conversational framework as well as the context in which we would talk about things like best practices. Next slide. So that diagram figured prominently in at least the second and third summits. The first summit was held in conjunction with the Research Data Alliance plenary in Montreal in 2017. So that was the first, it was very early in less than a year after I had started, and about a year and a half or so after Canary had started funding Research Data Canada. So it was fairly early in the timeline, and that was an opportunity to have a number of international stakeholders present to the Canadian colleagues at that meeting. The second summit was a year and a half later, held in Canada, Ontario. And the third also in Canada the following year in a similar time of year. The first one had a lot of sessions highlighting the national data services or what were certainly emerging or existing national data services. And it was the first version of the Canada Declaration, which we'll talk about shortly, that emerged from that second summit and was refined in the third summit. The third summit was a little more detailed in trying to get at some of the defining parameters of what it means to be a national data service in the Canadian context. And as you'll see at the end of the session today, the fourth summit will dive even more into the details of that national data services community. Next slide. And over to you, Robin.
Thanks, Mark. I will now talk to you a little bit about this year's summit event, which, as Mark mentioned, took place February 5th to 6th of this year in Canada, Ontario. So who were we? The NDSF 2020 summit had over 160 attendees from over 80 different institutions from Canada and the US. As you can see from the pie chart here, the vast majority of attendees identified as hailing from academic institutions. However, there is also a strong showing of nonprofit organizations as well. To a lesser extent, but still represented, were the federal government and private institutions. As far as individual affiliation, attendees mostly associated with libraries, with similarly strong showing from IT and from data organizations. Funders, service organizations, researchers, and research offices were also strongly represented. The 2020 NDSF Summit was planned and organized with targeted goals and outcomes in mind. These goals and outcomes included achieving consensus from participants on what minimal requirements define a national data service, what works best at the institutional, provincial, regional, national, and international levels, existing data services, both machine and human services, that provide either models for or operational examples of national data services, key gaps not articulated in either the Research Data Management Roadmap or Canada Declaration related documents, and finally, priorities moving forward. Achievements of the goals and outcomes from the previous slide are more concretely highlighted in the first of two key outputs of the NDSF Summit 2020 that we'll be covering today, the first of which being the summary and recommendations document. So attendees of the 2020 summit participated in 3 breakout sessions and were asked to consider 3 main topics which speak directly to the overall goals and outcomes previously mentioned. The first was requirements of a National Data Service or NDS. The second was to identify examples of existing and emerging data services as well as services that are needed moving forward. And finally, the third topic was to identify priorities for research data management in Canada, categorized by the next 6 months, the next 12 months, 2 years, and 5 years. Feedback from these breakout groups was transcribed into raw notes, analyzed, and finally rolled up into a summary which formed the basis of the NDSF Summit 2020 Summary and Recommendations document. So here's what we started with. You may not be able to read these very well, but these are a couple of examples of the handwritten charts that participants in breakout groups worked on, complete with the shadow of Mark's phone, backlit by airport lounge lighting, an elegant digitization technique, I know. These handwritten charts were transcribed into raw notes from which participant feedback was derived. The stickers you can see on the left-hand side, they represent in essence an upvote or a +1, indicating increased consensus and emphasis on those points. So after participant feedback was extracted and summarized from these raw notes, some overarching themes began to emerge across all 3 breakout sessions. As the RDMC ecosystem continues to evolve and Canadian stakeholders anticipate further alignment and coordination under the new DRI organization, like Mark mentioned, or NDRIO, as some of us affectionately call it, these overarching themes and concerns reflect those that participants identified as most relevant to progressing national data services in Canada. These included, as you can see, the importance of communication and training, the need for further alignment and integration of existing organizations and services, both Canadian and international, centralization and federation of Canadian research data management components, achieving a balance between domain-specific and domain-agnostic services, and the challenges of long-term data preservation and management of sensitive data. At the NDSF Summit in January 2019, RDC proposed a model for facilitation with the community based on the work of the European Open Science Cloud, or EOSC. The EOSC model was developed in March 2018 by the EOSC community to focus discussions on key layers of the RDM ecosystem, and it defines 6 lines of actions for a research infrastructure. The version of the model shown here was adapted for the Canadian context and was used in the 2019 Canary RDM workshop, as well as both the 2019 and 2020 NDSF summits. The 6 lines of action were used to categorize the presentations of the 2020 NDS Summit and were similarly used in the summary to categorize participant feedback from the breakout group sessions. So I'm just going to take a moment to go over the definitions of each of these categories, as they might prove useful in the next few slides, and they formed the structure of the summary and recommendations document. So as you'll notice, according to this model, architecture refers to the architecture necessary to create a federated system of data management platforms, tools, and resources that ensure interoperability and access to all Canadian researchers. Data refers to common standards and tools that support the FAIR principles across all disciplines while ensuring access to rich domain-specific data and metadata. Services are defined as both generic and discipline-specific services directly supporting researchers and institutions, as well as funder, publisher, and institutional policy. Access and interface includes both human and machine interfaces that make it easy to deposit and access data, including support for privacy and security, while the rules include the policy and process scaffolding that facilitates participation by all actors in the research ecosystem. Finally, governance is the framework that ensures representation by all actors in the development and sustainability of Canada's digital research infrastructure and ecosystem. Based on the overarching themes that emerged from participant feedback, 2 additional categories were introduced to reflect the importance of communication and of training as cross-cutting themes, in addition to the 6 lines of action just discussed. So here I have highlighted just a few of the most important points that emerged from participant feedback. These are just a taste of the kind of recommendations, requirements, and priorities that 2020 Summit participants identified, and that are in turn reflected in detail in the summary and recommendations document. I will not spend too much time reading all of these highlights, but I will draw attention to how a lot of these requirements, recommendations, and priorities feed into a vision of a national data services framework that is user and researcher focused, accommodates users in multiple disciplines and in multiple languages, and provides enhanced and open access to coordinated services and training. The ideal framework would also encourage best practices, possibly through incentivization, enable international interoperability, operate with transparency, and foster active engagement, inclusion, and representation of all sectors and domains, thus reflecting the diversity of its stakeholders. Again, a far more detailed version of these highlights and others are included in the full document. The summary and recommendations document also includes a mind map visualization of participant feedback. It is quite hard to see here. I apologize for the tiny script, but essentially all of the categorized feedback I just mentioned is further summarized and expressed visually here. Each of the 6 EOSC model categories, along with the 2 cross-cutting themes of communication and training, are depicted as swim lanes. As you can see from the legend below, each of the 3 breakout sessions are identified by different shaped boxes. The blue shaded boxes additionally indicate timeline assigned to various priorities, moving from 6 months on the left to 5 years on the right. And the multicolor smaller boxes feature existing, emerging, and needed national data services that were highlighted by participants in each category. So if we zoom in here, this is just the top half of the visualization. You can see a little more clearly the interconnectedness of the various recommendations, requirements, and priorities identified by breakout group participants. As you can see, some categories featured more time-sensitive priorities than others, and some are more related to existing services and platforms. For example, under data, a lot of services are highlighted with green meaning existing, yellow meaning emerging, and red meaning needed. While under services, more time-sensitive priorities are indicated, such as building and publishing and maintaining an RDM ecosystem knowledge base over the next 6 to 12 months, while an ongoing review of the RDM ecosystem is extended into the next 2 to 5 years. I will point out that some of these services may have progressed from emerging to existing, even in the time between the summit back in February and now, particularly with CUSE in the middle, for example. I will also mention that admittedly, this was my first time using this software. It's called Mind Manager. And not only was there a bit of a learning curve to discovering all the capabilities of the tool, the nature of what I was attempting to display visually was rather complex complex and multifaceted on its own. So it was definitely a bit of a challenge, but mostly a valuable learning experience and made for an interesting alternative way of looking at all of the participant feedback at once. So the final section of the document is where we pulled some of the most important emphasized points from participant feedback across all 3 breakout sessions and translated them into more concrete recommendations. A total of 40 recommendations were extracted from participant feedback and subsequently categorized and targeted to broad stakeholder groups. So these groups included researchers, research funders, universities and research centers, science-based government departments and agencies, repositories and publishers, and finally RDC, the Portage Network, and NDRIO. Targeting the feedback in this way allowed us to create a more clearly actionable output. Again, I've highlighted just a few of the 40 total recommendations featured in the document. These 7 recommendations here were targeted broadly for all stakeholders. These recommendations and the others included in the document are ultimately intended to facilitate researcher adoption of best practices in data management throughout the data lifecycle and the research lifecycle. So while they are addressed primarily at the stakeholder community that supports researchers, the goal overall is to see benefits to the researchers. Again, I will not take too much time reading all of these to you. For a full list of the recommendations, I will refer you to the last section of the summary and recommendations document. However, you will notice that a lot of the overarching themes and highlights from all 3 breakout groups naturally emerge in the recommendations, with a focus on communication, training, diverse and inclusive representation, and multilingual support, as well as an added emphasis on Indigenous data services, long-term data preservation, and establishing funding for highly qualified RDM personnel, particularly for smaller institutions. I would encourage you to take a look at the full summary and recommendations document to dig a little deeper into these recommendations and into anything I've talked about so far today. I will now pass things back over to Mark, who is going to go over the other key output from this year's NDSF Summit, which is an updated version of the Canada Declaration. So over to you, Mark.
Well, thanks for that, Robin. And that kind of your comments later in your remarks highlight my other shout out, which is to Canada's excellent library schools, or iSchools, of which Robin is a graduate of the one at Dalhousie. And I highlight that because we've been very lucky to have a number of interns from our iSchools who have been great participants in the conversation with the RDC stakeholder community. In fact, Robin's departure is coming up fairly soon, so there is a posting, just went up, I think it was today, for a new RDC intern. So I would direct you to the RDC website and the news menu at the top. If you are interested, or you have colleagues who are interested, that don't have to be from an information school, but we would certainly encourage any qualified candidate to submit an application. Next slide. It's great to have these opportunities for these shout outs, and the timing is perfect. And I think a good example of the preparedness that the graduates from the iSchools have is a good example of that is Robin's quick pickup of the Mind Manager tool, which is quite a bit more robust and complicated than the average mind map tool. So to the Canada Declaration, of course, the Canada Declaration, as I mentioned, the first one came out as a result of the 2019 NDSF Summit. It was pulled together not explicitly from the community members constructing statements, but the 18 or so statements from the first declaration were pulled out of the text as the efforts of the community that had gathered for that summit had their discussions. We use, as we do with the newer version, the statement uses a series of keywords to present principles. So those are recognize, highlight, resolve, commit, and call. And we felt it was important. And of course, we didn't, this form of declaration is not uncommon. we actually based the first Canada Declaration on one that had just emerged from the data management community in Europe. So it was important for us, though, to, as the national conversation about data management services and resources moved ahead, to have a principles-based approach to that conversation. So the goal of a set of principles like those represented in the Canada Declaration is partly to articulate the primary interests of researchers in the context of data management, but also, as we've alluded to a couple of times, to frame the ongoing discussions in the provision of that support. Also to facilitate kind of what I call rules of participation for national data services. So what is it that a service, again, human or machine or a combination of the two, would need to adhere to in order to be labeled a national data service? And the other important thing, which again we'll mention in a little while, is that the Canada Declaration and those principles provide a matrix through which we can report ongoing efforts back to the community. Next slide. So this past February, there was a series of feedback loops that were used to get the community's feedback on the first declaration. So one was a Survey Monkey form that duplicated each of the 18 statements in the declaration and asked people to modify or otherwise report on developments in those. There was also a public feedback period after we created a new version from that feedback. There was a discussion at the NDSF summit, and then there was an additional set of edits made and a second period of public feedback for the declaration. And I highlight this because, again, I think it's important to understand that a principles-based document, and we do tend to see a fair number of those in not just our data management community, but in others as well. And I think that simply reflects their importance, I think, more than anything. And in the case of RDC, we felt it was particularly important that the declaration and the statements therein reflected the conversation by the community and the stakeholders. So in the new version, 5 or 6 additional statements were added. There was a lot of feedback from a very broad range of members of the stakeholder community. So we were very pleased that we did get that fulsome, broad feedback from RDC stakeholders. Next slide. So just to give you a sense of that process, I mean, many people on the call, I'm sure, have contributed to a Google document and the process and how it can work in terms of suggestions and comments and all those kinds of things. So this is just an example of 2 separate statements. In the case of the first one, which is labeled B, that's part of a larger statement, but it gives you a sense of the original statement with the crossed out sections and the modifications and additions that were made. And then the second one, there was an important series of conversations at both the more recent summits, but in particular the one this past February that highlighted the need for focus on Indigenous data issues and sovereignty and other components. So there was a particular care taken to reflecting appropriate change in those. So you can get a sense here of the degree of change and the process that was used. Next slide. So just to, and again, like Robin, this is not the right time to go through each of the statements in one by one, but I will highlight a few. And as I did in the summit, with the statement as it was in the first Canada Declaration, the first statement does recognize that researchers are the focal point. So this is a very important, and I think unfortunately not always remembered or easily implemented principle in this conversation, and that is that all of the things that we talk about and do need to be researcher centric. And as I said, well, it's not always possible to do that easily. This statement highlights that that must be undertaken at all stages of this conversation. So that's an all-important kind of foundational statement in the declaration. Next slide. One of the things that was included in the first declaration and carried through were just some statements to highlight elements of that six-part EOS model that Robin presented. So just a couple of examples here using the architecture, data, and services. Each one of these has 4 or 5 separate kind of statements, but these again just kind of give you a sense of the types of principles that a document like the Canada Declaration represent. And I would in particular bring attention to the third one, the sustainable support, whether it's financial, training, shared infrastructure, personnel, that's such a critical aspect of our existing and emerging platforms and services, both those at the institutions and domain specific and the national ones. And I highlight this one because like the domains in which our researchers focus their efforts, I think funders also operate in what I would call a kind of a constricted or siloized context. And the same funding resources that typically go to support our infrastructures are in the same kind of competitive funding pipeline approach that any research grant is. So the opportunity for data repository managers and others to maintain these important infrastructures in the long term is compromised by the need to continually go back every 2 or 3 years for additional soft money or project money. So the emergence of NDRIO in this conversation, I think, is a great example of Canada's commitment to a more sustainable ecosystem. So I think we're certainly colleagues in the research data management community are quite pleased to see that commitment from the federal government and are looking forward to NDRIO's efforts over the next while. Next slide. These are the other 3 parts of the 6-part model. Again, very important examples. I would just highlight the last one, governance. Governance is one of those things that we kind of, again, not pay lip service to, clearly. Many of the organizations that are part of this community have very strong and robust governance. But I think an important element that came out of the conversation was the promotion of the integration of a cross-sectoral approach. So including higher education, nonprofit, commercial, and provincial and federal governments. So that broad stakeholder community representation, I think, is a signature of RDC's governance model. And I think the community felt that cross-sectoral approach was critical, not just in defining a robust set of national data services, but also in coming back to that previous point about sustainability and the need to ensure robust funding. So I think these two go hand in hand. Next slide. As I mentioned, with the example of the edited text, the issues around or opportunities around Indigenous data sovereignty and the considerations were promoted much more prominently in the current Canada Declaration. This one highlights again the role of our First Nations, Métis and Inuit communities, and the broader Indigenous communities as well, in terms of participating in the conversation and also in delivering appropriate responses. In particular, again, in this one, I would highlight the OCAP and CARE principles. Of course, OCAP comes from our First Nations community. The CARE principles are a similar set of principles that were developed by the international community, emerged out of the Research Data Alliance, and subsequently have resulted in the creation of a separate organization called GIDA, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And the one thing that has always struck me as I learn more and more by listening to my colleagues in the various communities is how apropos or how appropriate sets of principles like OCAP and CARE are to all researchers. I mean, they're clearly created to represent the interests and the approaches of groups like our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities in terms of data sovereignty and the like. But I think all researchers could benefit by a careful read of those principles from their own context, whether it involves Indigenous researchers or research or participants or not. Next slide. Another very prominent thread of conversation throughout the National Data Services Framework Summits has been the issues around privacy and ownership of data. So these two statements are examples of that. And I think certainly the privacy, the challenges around privacy, one simply has to look at some of the challenges and issues that have arisen in the current COVID-19 pandemic context. And the challenge is not just in researchers having access to the kinds of data that they need to make important innovations and discoveries, but also the protection that the care that needs to be taken in providing access to that data to protect the privacy of the individual people to whom that data applies. And we also see that recently with the launch a couple of weeks ago of the ISED, our government agency that funds a lot of the research and funding agencies in the Canadian context. ISED and partners released a couple of weeks ago a new portal that is devoted to helping researchers understand how to best protect and secure their research data. So there's always an interesting balance between, sometimes a gentle tension, I would say, between the need to protect privacy and the need to ensure that researchers have access to the kind of data that they need in order to make discoveries. Next slide. Lastly, just to highlight, of course, a very important part, and Robin highlighted this in her summary of the NDSF summit, there's a responsibility to report back to the community. I think for me in particular, the number one requirement in the production of a principles-based framework like the Canada Declaration is that responsibility to report back to the community on the efforts that are undertaken in response, not always clearly to a specific set of principles, but clearly in response to the importance that a set of principles like those in the Canada Declaration highlight. So Research Data Canada takes that responsibility very seriously. And Robin and I have been working on a reporting matrix that uses the principles and the statements in the Canada Declaration as a reporting mechanism to inform the broader stakeholder community, as well as our international colleagues, on the progress that's made in developing these national data services. Next slide. So maybe just a final word. So, I mean, clearly the ultimate goal of a document like the Canada Declaration is to provide that high-level principles-based approach to ensuring researchers get the best support that they can to facilitate their data sharing and stewardship. But the other, for me, really important aspect of a principles-based document is it is something that you can, it's a foundational document or conversation or whatever, however you look at it, piece of information that you can always go back to when you get stuck in the weeds and you're spending a lot of time detailing those exact data services and resources. So it is good to have this kind of foundational document to kind of reach back to when the details get overwhelming or when you get kind of caught or stuck in those weeds. So that's, for me, a very important aspect of this kind of approach and why these kinds of principles-based documents and activities that take a principles-based approach are so important in our conversation. Next slide. And next one. So just a few words on our next summit. So with the exception of the very first summit, each of the subsequent summits have had a working group that comes together on a regular basis, and as the time comes near, a more regular basis, to plan out the details of how the summit will work. So we are in the early planning stages for the next summit, Summit 2021, which is intended to take place in February. It will be a virtual summit for obvious reasons. It will focus in again on the details of national data services, both in respect of the emergence of NDRIO in this transition period. So how can the broader stakeholder community come together at the summit to help inform NDRIO in this transition period? The breakout themes will derive their kind of topical concepts from the Canada Declaration, but the key concept in this declaration will be to highlight, enhance, and or develop actionable objectives that can be moved forward by the broader community and colleague organizations like NDRIO. So in the lead up to that summit, we will, over the coming months, present that reporting matrix based on the Canada Declaration. We'll also have some additional background documents. Sometime in the next 2 to 4 weeks, the broader community will have an opportunity to review a position paper that NDRIO has prepared. It's the first draft is done. It's kind of going through some additional internal review and a review with a few stakeholder organizations like RDC, with the goal of producing a more polished draft that can then be more broadly sent out more broadly and get feedback from that broader stakeholder community. That same data management position paper that will be coming out shortly will be followed with the position papers in the other two kinds of pillars of the NDRIO organization. Those are research software and advanced research computing. So I think it's safe to say that the next 2 to 6 months in the national conversation in Canada will be very much defined by outreach, communication, and consultation. And I want to really highlight that this is an opportunity, and the best opportunity for all of you and your colleagues in the broader national stakeholder community in terms of research to get feedback into this process that NDRIO is undertaking. Next slide. So that's it for our summary and overview. We're happy to take any questions that people might have or comments. A number of people on the call, as I said, were present at one or more of the summit. So feel free to type any comments or questions you might have in the Q&A. And we'll just wait a few minutes because, so we have one. Robin, did you want to read that one? Oh, sorry, you know what? Here, let me take a stab. So the comment is the interest in how many stakeholders were involved in the summits and the declaration and the reports. So in terms of emerging researchers, are there any roles for the disciplinary professional associations and societies to play? Are they represented in the previous summits? So that's a very good question. I'll see if Robin has a response, but I would say that there are organizations like CAGS, the Canadian Association of Graduate Students, for example, that is plugged into the conversations, and there was a change in the senior leadership at CAGS at the time of the last summit, but certainly the current CEO at CAGS is an active participant in some of the conversations. So that kind of end, if you will, of the engaging researchers piece is certainly well in place. RDC has communication conduits out to Vice President's research and other colleagues, but this question really gets at one of the hard nuts in this whole thing, and that is how to really get as many researchers as possible involved in the process. So the fact that there were a number of researchers at the summits, all of the summits, I think is a good sign. NDRIO's new researcher council, which was announced a couple of weeks ago, is another good example of a entirely researcher focused body that will provide consultation and advice to NDRIO. But certainly we're more than happy to take suggestions, comments from the broader stakeholder community on ways that we can increase outreach to the researcher community for sure, including through those professional associations and societies. Robin, I don't know if you would add anything there.
I would second all of that. And my other thought is that one of the previous slides, there was a pie chart as far as attendee affiliation and the types of organizations that were represented, but they were more generalized, and that the point of whether kind of professional associations or societies, whether those were represented similarly, that would be something interesting to look at for the 2021 summit. And perhaps that kind of representation could even be actively engaged to participate in the next summit. So that's definitely a great idea.
Yeah, good suggestion. We did have a couple. I mean, they tended to be more on the best practices standards side, such as the GA4GH, the genomics kind of data standards or international organization, which happens to be led by a Canadian. So I think there were a few of the association level representatives at the summits, but I think we can definitely improve that, as Robin suggests.
Any other questions?
So you did a great job, Robin. You've explained that one mind map does answers all the questions.
That was the intent.
So just maybe as a final comment, we would be more than happy, as we said, to get feedback from you and your colleagues on things we can do to improve on the coming summit. As I said, the working group has met a couple of times already and has an initial kind of working document that we've pulled together for discussion at our next call, which will highlight some of the ways that we can handle it. At this point in time, what we have kind of come to agreement on is that we're talking about a 12-hour event, either run over 2 days or 3 days, probably in the same week, to kind of give people a focused opportunity. There will be fewer presentations and more breakouts. In our current prototype, we have 5 breakout sessions, kind of a lead in and a lead out session with 3 sessions in the middle to dive very heavily into the details. So as I said, we're kind of approaching this next summit as very much a working meeting, and bringing people together who have diverse experiences and knowledge to bring to the table, hopefully involved in each of the separate breakouts. There's a question: has there been any discussion around improving the discovery of restricted or hard to find data? For example, if I'm a researcher who wants to make their data discoverable but can't make it publicly accessible, what options do I have? I think that that's one of the core concepts of the FAIR principles, the F, the findable, and the A, the accessible piece. So I think one example that's emerging and will be going live in an operational context fairly soon is the Federated Research Data Repository, or FRDR, which initially will provide a very robust and feature-rich discovery of national research data outputs. and its emphasis is on harvesting metadata to make it discoverable. So I think that one of the things that the Portage team, which has partnered with Compute Canada on the development of FURDR, have in mind is an approach to harvesting metadata in a fulsome way to do things like what you've suggested here, at least making data, whether or not the data can be publicly accessible, making sure that it is discoverable. So I think that's one example of an important national data service that is in the works. And its fundamental structure allows it to harvest metadata from institutions, regional data repositories, as well as national data repository and domain-specific data repositories. So I think that's an important example of something that can be done there. The other thing, of course, is to make sure that systems like ORCID, I think the valuable value proposition that the ORCID registry presents is that it allows researchers to add to their ORCID profile those metadata records that they want to be discoverable. And then systems like data repositories and discovery layers can harvest that ORCID information for Canadian researchers as another way to surface the information that otherwise would be hard to discover. So I think there's all kinds of opportunities there to facilitate that effort. Also a comment, and an important one, because we haven't mentioned too much about Canada's colleges, institutes, and polytechnics. But that certainly is another communication conduit that we do have. And it's pointed out that the School of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies, which accommodates all aspects of higher education institutions, I think is an important RDM outreach to that community as well. Just to follow up to the question about better discovery for data sets that can't be publicly accessible. Also the thought that we need better metadata to help people understand access restrictions. So yes, another good point. I think our library community in particular does a good job of highlighting the opportunity to make metadata accessible, but also to make the licensing associated with those data sets clear. That tends to be a default form field in all of these repository systems is the appropriate license. So that's an important point.
One that would potentially be pretty good for a breakout session as well, I'd say.
Yes. Yeah, and Robin raises a good point. I mean, you have our email addresses there. So if you do have particular thoughts on themes, specific details that you would like to get at in terms of the national data services, then we would be happy to hear from you and make sure that we incorporate your thoughts into our planning. Our goal is to have an official announcement before the end of the calendar year for the NDSF Summit 2021. And that would be accompanied by an element of detail about how the summit will be conducted. We don't have firm dates yet because we're trying to make sure we don't collide with any breaks or anything else that would otherwise kind of compromise people's ability to attend. And we are also looking at various options for platforms to facilitate breakouts and the kinds of conversations that lead to such great outcomes when they're face-to-face. So we hope to deliver a strong, not just program, but also a platform that will facilitate that conversation. Okay, so not seeing any more questions. I'll let Robin have the final word, but I would just again thank everybody for attending today's webinar. You will see an announcement going out later today about RDC's next webinar. This is actually a 5-part series on data ownership. And we have a very strong lineup of colleagues who will participate both in speaker type webinars as well as panels, including a session in part 2 on Indigenous data and data sovereignty, and a final closing session on open science. So a very exciting webinar series coming up. And again, something that Robin put a lot of time and effort into it. So again, many thanks to Robin for her efforts. And I see she's continuing in that effort by putting the link to our upcoming webinars. So with that, and thanks again to everybody, and hopefully many of you are able to attend the 2021 summit. Robin, I'll pass it over to you for final comments.
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. It's been a great audience and a unpacked little hour, but it's also been a nice opportunity to have quite a circularity in my role here at Research Data Canada. These documents were among the first projects that I started with just under 6 months ago, and so to be able to present them today it's quite nice. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for those closing remarks, Robin. And everybody will receive an email with the link to the recorded session, both French and English. So thanks all. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you.
And thanks to our French interpreter, Anthony. We'll be in touch, I'm sure.
Bye all.